it felt like, for a while we were just continuously back to back to study. And it became hard to really allow people to sit on those findings and practice the storytelling. And though generative AI is really good for the analysis, it's not going to go out and tell your story for you. It's not going to sell these ideas to your stakeholders.
Welcome to Insights Unlocked, an original podcast from UserTesting, where we bring you candid conversations and stories with the thinkers, doers, and builders behind some of the most successful digital products and experiences in the world, from concept to execution.
Welcome to the Insights Unlocked podcast. I'm Nathan Isaacs, Principal Content Marketing Manager at UserTesting. And joining us today as host is Michael Domanic, UserTesting's Head of AI. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, everyone. As always, it's great to be here.
And our guest today is Alita Kendrick. Alita is a UX researcher at Google, where she leads accessibility research for the Google Cloud Platform and explores new market opportunities. With a background at Nielsen Norman Group, she brings deep expertise in design systems, research methods, and turning insights into strategy. Welcome to the show, Alita.
Lovely to be here. Thanks, y'all.
So, Alita, it's great to have you here. I think maybe a good place for us to start our conversation is to kind of, pick up potentially where we left off in your presentation. So you had come to our Human Insight Summit last fall. That presentation really resonated with our attendees and with our audience. So in it, you shared how AI tools are significantly reducing the time it takes for you to produce insights for your work. Can you help our listeners understand, how are you and your team, how are you using tools like Gemini to improve your research process? And, potentially any updates on, use cases and things that you've been doing since that talk in the fall?
Absolutely. So I'll start a little bit high level, and then we can kind of drill into each one of the phases. If I'm thinking about like a traditional research process, right, starting with defining the problem space, clearly articulating the problems we're looking to solve and the questions we're looking to answer. Really where I'm using generative AI specifically is helping me speed up the creation of some of my planning documents, managing some of my participant communications and stakeholder communications, as well as super lightweight things like developing a project timeline where maybe I have a bunch of times in my brain, but like the use of AI can just help me speed up the actual documentation of some of those things. In the more planning cycle related to the specific method selection and things like that, again, drafting some of that participant communications through the use of generative AI can speed some of that up, and also help me determine kind of some of those study guides or additional resources used throughout my testing. Usually I have like a full script with my participants that I create. That's kind of a common methodology, but this just helps me in getting that time to delivery a little bit shorter. In the context of conducting the actual study, of course, this varies from study to study, but one of my recent use cases with user testing is a great example of how, a lot of the AI synthesis that you all use can really help speed up interpretation, which gives me as a practitioner a little bit more time to focus on the storytelling, the democratization of those insights, and really pushing for action. And then finally, of course, that like large phase of analysis where I commented of how user testing can play a role. And then, of course, when I'm doing methods that may be more interview focused or concept testing in a moderated situation, of course, generative AI like Gemini can really help with qualitative data analysis. I love using this as sort of the halfway point for a lot of my studies. I'll do a check-in with generative AI to say, okay, based on all of these transcripts and my core research questions, how am I looking? Like, am I answering those questions, or what should I be prioritizing in the second half? So there's so many applications from those early stages of study definition all the way into analysis and presentation.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you've talked about a lot. Like, there's like, I feel like so much to unpack there. I think, like one of the things that, our listeners, they're in similar roles. A lot of our listeners are in similar roles to yours, and they're thinking about how do we integrate AI into our process. But a lot of times I think before they do that, they're kind of curious about like, how much time is this actually going to save me? Is that something that you're tracking and kind of reporting throughout the organization?
Yeah, from a qualitative perspective, absolutely. So I'll speak specifically to some of my experiences because I've become quite process oriented over the past couple of years, and that's enabled me to really look more detailed at how much time I was spending at certain phases. So even just looking back at my calendar from 3 years ago, engaging, okay, I would have research blocks on my calendar, like 2 weeks set aside for analysis. Those types of things can actually be sped up into just be a couple of days to highlight those top takeaways. And then really within a week, I can turn around findings. And that's been quite consistent for me throughout, the presence of generative AI, and particularly over these last 2 years. I would say on average for a lot of my own analysis, particularly of qualitative data, that's cut in half for me. And of course, there's whenever we're introducing new processes and new tools into our workflows, there's always that bit of growing pains, right? Where you're learning, you're setting up yourself for success, you're figuring out what's working, what's not. And I know for a lot of people in this era of generative AI, that's kind of the hardest part, right? Is just figuring out where to start. But maintaining that continuous perspective of experimentation and reflection in the same way as we do with our products will serve you well in kind of this advent of generative AI for our processes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I think you talked about in the analysis phase, you would block off 2 weeks, right? Now you're doing that in a couple of days. Like that's a pretty meaningful change. What has gaining back that time allowed you and your team to do more of?
Definitely, as an individual, more time spent democratizing access to those insights and sharing them out. It felt like, for a while, we were just continuously back to back to study. And it became hard to really allow people to sit on those findings and practice the storytelling. And though generative AI is really good for the analysis, it's not going to go out and tell your story for you. It's not going to sell these ideas to your stakeholders. So I found so much value in that in addition to reflecting more on the process side. So, as I said, over the past couple of years, it's really freed me up to think more about the research operations of the programs that I'm owning, which again, can't really, generative AI can help. It's augmenting some of that, but it's not leading the charge as it can with some of the data analysis. So, definitely the ops, the relationship building, the storytelling, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. So it's integrating AI into the process of conducting the research, pulling out the insights. But then on the other side, how do we use generative AI to help us share those insights and democratize them out to a larger cross section of our organization? So I heard you talk about Gemini as being like an important general purpose tool, like a general purpose AI tool in that process. You mentioned the AI features in user testing as a point solution that you're using. What other tools might be in the mix here that are helping you and your team?
Yeah, for all of the program areas that I own, there's a notebook LM for each one of those. And
Oh,
that
I
has
love that product, by the way. I use it every day.
I love that. It's so cool to hear like two different levels of usage then of like consolidation of lots of insights and then again that kind of ideation, mind mapping, connecting the dots. I love to hear that.
Yeah, great. So Notebook LM, we've got Gemini as a general purpose tool. Again, user testing as a point solution. Anything else that's a common part of the practice? Like any other AI tools that are kind of in the mix there?
I'll leave it at that for the Google side, but on, as I mentioned, kind of being an instructor at Nielsen Norman Group, I recently developed a class called Efficient UX Doing More with Less. And that really has pushed me to learn a lot of the different AI tools out there. I mean, I had always been quite experimental and actively engaged with what's happening with GPT, what's happening with Claude, and different generative models, as well as things like Perplexity, Midjourney, and all of that. But through this class, I really focused a lot on learning those areas. And of course, you get the sense of the competitive analysis, what works best, in different contexts. But I think for me, as someone who is not only a heavily active user of these, but also a designer of them, it is really nice to compare those. So depending on the types of tasks, particularly in the case of some of my consulting or my work with Nielsen Norman Group, I'll put it in a bunch. Like I'll put the same prompts in Claude and in Gemini and GPT. Because as a researcher, we're curious, right? One of my favorite things about Gemini, and this is so core to my workflow, is the voice experience. So being able to just talk to Gemini and have it listen. And I use that all the time for mind mapping. That's completely revolutionized the way that I do my mind mapping and brainstorming. Because since the beginning of my career, I've been that person, with a big Post-it board. I have my Post-it notes and my Sharpie for everything, and I'm kind of going about. But sometimes, I know it's funny to say this, but sometimes the physical labor of typing or of writing is just like a blocker to me and wanting to do it. Like, I just want to be able to speak and express my thoughts verbally, and generative AI has just been fantastic for that. And to your point of kind of the writing side as well, getting it used to your way of thinking can really help notice those thought traps over time, or help notice where there may be some bias. Because I know, as an industry, we'll talk a lot about the bias that is implicit in these models. But what I don't think people talk enough about is how it can really help you identify your own bias and kind of help correct that in your own thinking, particularly in reporting when it comes to data and things like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, like, coming back to AI in the process of conducting UX research, are there any common mistakes that you see UX researchers typically making when first trying to leverage AI into their work? And, if there's any suggestions you have about how to avoid those mistakes.
Yeah, I notice a lot of people just jump in directly and kind of ask their question. And it for sure is a best practice to really define what you're looking to get out of the models. Sometimes it's good from the beginning with no context, but to just make it much more likely that you're going to get a quality output that's actually answering your question. The more context you can provide about the AI's role, its objective, the context of your problem space. You can even get as defined as specifying the desired outcome or output when you're in a quite of a defined context. Of course, if you're doing more open-ended activities like brainstorming potential use cases for a feature, or potential research questions in a topic space like information architecture overhauls, things like that, maybe not as much specifying the output, but still defining the role and that context is really helpful. I'll find some people when they're really trying to identify areas to use generative AI, they may get into specific of a context at their very first attempt and then receive outputs that don't meet their needs, and that kind of scars them away from it for a while. And the whole point with this is really being experimental. And I think that AI from a social aspect has really come about and in some ways scared some people. There's, of course, the talks of like, oh, it's going to steal my job, it's going to do this, it's going to do that. But I think now we're really at that phase where it is, you do need to be experimenting. And even if in the beginning it's not giving you what you want, don't bring a fixed mindset to that. Take an experimental lens to say, okay, how can I improve these prompts? And Michael, I know you and I have talked about this, but the use of Midjourney has been that for me. And so with Midjourney getting started, I was like, I don't know how to write a really good visual prompt. Like, I'm coming back with things that aren't really fitting my needs. So then I'm like, I'm just going to ask GPT, or I'm going to ask Gemini to write the prompt for me. And instantly the quality shoots up. So
Use AI to use AI.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So speaking of the outputs, I think I remember in your talk in the fall, you had mentioned that you approach those outputs with a healthy level of skepticism, right? So how do you balance the usefulness of the output against making sure that you have that healthy skepticism?
Yeah, you have to be so close to the data. Like, for anything that I'm putting into GPT, to Gemini, to any generative AI model, I am the subject matter expert of that research study, of the project context. And so, of course, being that person who facilitated all the sessions and things like that, I'm going to be able to know if something's a little fishy, if it feels like a stretch, or they're calling out or overemphasizing themes that I'm like, really, that only came up once. So your closeness to the context that you're asking about is so important. It would be like me using a generative AI to be a lawyer for me, and I'm not a lawyer. So, like, it sounds right, it sounds good, but I don't have that closeness with that profession to know what's actually quality and what's not. And that's definitely a mistake that people will make early on.
Yeah. Do you think there areas of UX research that generative AI maybe doesn't fit in?
Hmm. I think from an experimental lens, always, I think that there's always an opportunity to engage with it, but the usefulness of it kind of depends on, again, how close you are to the data, your overall level of, you want it to sound like you and still fit like you. That's another thing that I'll see from people is you'll be able to tell, like, this was entirely done with a generative, like, it doesn't sound like you, it doesn't fit, the vibe of the way that you speak or the way that you think. And I think those are contexts where, if anything, you might start to see an over-reliance on that. And when it's purely generative AI, that's an easy way to, okay, maybe we don't need that job. But if you're layering in your own information, your product context, your organizational context, and things like that, it maintains its value.
Yeah. So I think, what we were saying that it sounds like generative AI, like a lot of these outputs that people end up taking, like they just take it and it's very anodyne what it comes back with, right? It doesn't have a ton of your personality in it. Is there anything that you're doing to make sure that it sounds like you and takes on more of your personality when it's giving you outputs, especially when you might end up using those outputs somewhere else?
Yeah, I'll give 2 examples. I'll give a Google example and then an NEG example. In the context of Google, I do still do a lot of that speech to text, and I'll make it quite particular to say, keep my tone of voice, keep my way of speaking, because my way of speaking does translate well to my documentation. And I've also been in situations where, I have the first draft done and I'll put that in and make it clear to not change the tone of voice or the writing style too much. Just maintain action-oriented language, clear conciseness.
What I do typically is I'll give it writing samples of stuff that I've written and say, here's me, like, here's my voice, here's my tone. This is what I typically sound like when I write, mimic that, right? I think the problem that I have is my writing is pretty anodyne. So like it doesn't have a lot of character or personality to it. So then ChatGPT just sounds like me and ChatGPT, which is not
Yeah.
always ideal, but
But I think then that standard way of speaking is the style then, and that's such an approachable, like, inclusive way of speaking then as well. And I do exactly what you're talking about, for my NNG content. So I recently published an article on fixed and growth mindsets in UX, and that was a case where I've published so much for them that my writing style can be quite defined. And so in using, Anthropic, I used Claude for that to help me in copy editing that work. It matched my style. And so it is, when people are getting into those situations of more publishing and things like that, even if it's just, your consistent research reports, that's something that you can all provide that as context to the model and say, okay, now based on what we're working on, improve this content, but ensure it's matching my way of speaking and my style. Because I think you will be, I always think about, especially now in being in a large corporation, of just your brand as an individual and as a contributor to your team. And your brand is often seen through the deliverables that you're sharing. So when someone goes through kind of such a stark revamp around this time of generative AI, you're kind of like, oh, okay, like how much reliance do you have on this? And I think we might be getting to that point where we're like, we want to make sure it's a merged view. It's the AI being helpful, but it's not leading the creation of all of this work.
yeah, 100%. You touched on something earlier I'd like to come back to, and I think this was something that you brought up in your presentation in the fall, and that is really around the topic of maintaining objectivity in your UX research. And I know it's a goal to remove your bias when you're pulling out insights and when you're trying to really report on what your users are telling you. How is AI helping with that process?
Yeah, I love that because AI has really changed the way that I take notes during my sessions. Before generative AI, and I've had the same research note-taking template since the start of my career. And it was quite simple in that it was a timestamp, a question or a theme that I'm noting, and then the actual note column, and then a separate column for tags of like question marks for follow-ups, exclamation points, and things like that. And when I was taking notes back then, it was like everything. It would be quotes, it would be a key takeaway, it would be they clicked this and this was their workflow. So it was so many different levels of note taking because you want to get it all in. Now, with the use of generative AI, I'm already getting transcripts, so I can really focus on whatever quotes I'm documenting, they're probably going to make it into the report, or that's like a really nice high value quote. If I'm highlighting an action, it's probably a specific theme that I'm like, okay, this is going to be a top takeaway. So during the session, I can be much more focused because I'm not scrambling to take as many notes because they're already being tracked. And I think from there, we take those, and then I have basically a medium-sized Post-it note where I have all the top takeaways from that. And so as I'm analyzing that data through the use of something like Gemini, I'm saying, here's my session by session top takeaways. Here's all the participant transcripts. What are you seeing as the main takeaways from this? Because again, everyone's biased. Sometimes people will talk about bias as like, oh, it's this bad thing, right? Ooh, bias. Really, it's just our perspective, right? Which is informed by our past experiences and things like that, culture, all that good stuff. So in the context of our findings, I may say, okay, I have an implicit bias that like, I think this is going on. And so I make note of that in my own interpretations. But really, when the model goes through it, maybe it's like, yeah, that's a little bit there, but it's maybe not as there as prominently as you're connecting those dots. And so I think that's such a solid way where we can start to say, what are we seeing? What is the model seeing? And kind of merge that story together. And again, sometimes you might be in these contexts where, yes, the model knows about the sessions, you know about the sessions, but you as the leader of this work also understand your business context. So you might be in a situation where, sure, the generative AI is suggesting X, Y, Z, but from a business perspective and your organizational perspective, that's actually not connecting in the way that it should. So this is where, again, that storytelling is so important. And you can't just take it as face value of, okay, the model said this, so this is our source of truth. It still only has limited context compared to everything that you know.
Yeah. And so does that connect back to the point you were making earlier about democratizing these insights? Yeah. So I think that's democratizing research, right? Like that's such a big thing in UX research, and it has been for, the last several years. It's interesting because I talk to a lot of our customers about this as well. It's like, okay, you've got all these really robust democratization programs going, where you have non-researchers getting involved in the research process or in the synthesis process or all of it, right? And there is an interesting role, I think, that AI does play in that process. I mean, do you have any like more like specific examples of how your team is doing that? How does AI fold into just the larger democratization efforts in your research process?
Early on, to your point of kind of seeing multiple perspectives too, even in the study planning, I can say like, okay, here's my research plan, you're a UXR, but like from a product perspective, what questions might you be wondering? From an interaction design perspective, what might you be wondering? And even I think that level of foresight and proactivity, when your stakeholders then go and review that doc, they're like, oh, okay, this is well-rounded, it's well-structured, in a way that it may not have been had that not been top of mind. And, without the use of generative AI, those types of tasks can say, oh, it's going to take me so much time. I need to really sit down and empathize with my PMs or with my interaction designer and this and that. But that can definitely speed up against some of that proactive side of things. Later on, one of the things that I've noticed, particularly at Google, is there's so much research being done, like incredible quantities of research, and things are moving so fast that sometimes that research just gets buried by, what's hot and new, in the same way that generative AI buried a lot of that. And so one thing that I'm using generative AI for a little bit more right now is more creative views of, taking reports that I had and repackaging them in a more interesting way. At the user testing conference, I know there was a talk about this where one of the practitioners used tarot cards to help with the storytelling. And I thought that, that example has stuck with me so much because it's such a beautiful way to, again, repackage our standardized research reports in a way that's more interesting. Because in this era of just, big data is beyond big data now, and we're stacking generative AI on top of it, and things are kind of starting to look the same. We want to make sure that we are being those creative storytellers and really insightful storytellers, and generative AI can help with that as well.
The democratization thing I think is really interesting too, because I've been pretty close to a lot of democratization programs being here at UserTesting over the last several years. What I see is that it is a lot of these programs lean heavily on UX researchers, like expert UX researchers, right? Now what I'm seeing is those researchers are starting to create custom GPTs or gems, right? That are, that reference point for conducting like really good research. You still want to keep that process on the rails, but now there are new possibilities to maybe outsource a little bit of that expertise to AI and free up UX researchers to do the work that they're really good at. So yeah, it's
Absolutely.
really
Yeah.
interesting.
I see so frequently that researchers' backlogs are just massive, and there's always more studies to be done than researchers to do it. And so, particularly through, agents and more autonomous and just artificial intelligence, we will be able to do more research. But it's not just the fact of doing more studies, it's also increasing the impact from those studies as well.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think that like you can continue to bring AI into the process to help create those efficiencies, but I don't know if that backlog ever gets smaller, right? Because the more time that you have to do that really interesting in-depth research, the more you can do, right? So yeah, I don't know that that's going to go anywhere anytime soon. And I think that is like the possibility of AI and UX research.
Yeah,
Um,
100%. It's so interesting to see practitioners experimenting with things. One of the things that I heard most commonly from the user testing conference were people coming up to me and just saying, it's been so hard to get started. And this was back in October. So, people then are still struggling to just get started, and people really commenting on how helpful it is just to have that prompt cheat sheet to say, okay, what are some specific prompts that I can just get started with and not have to think about it? So I think organizationally, if you are an organization looking to really up level the use of generative AI, it's definitely top down. Google was great at this. They ensured, people are doing their AI trainings and things like that. And I think that level of top down really gets people on board to say, okay, this is something that I need to prioritize now. My leadership is very involved. And then just keep up that momentum of experimenting. I even have a doc for myself. I have lots of scratch pad docs for my different programs. And I have a doc of just that is like my go to prompts. One that I know I've talked about with you before is I adapt so many things from consulting, just coming from that arena. And one of the things that I absolutely love for my surveys is asking the generative AI to ensure the options are MISI, mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And that has made so many of my survey questions much better in a way that like would have taken me hours and additional research and things like that, where I'm like, no, this makes sense. Like, this is good, solid. Okay.
yeah. So, Alita, I have to be honest with you, it doesn't surprise me that there's smart people at Google that are really embracing all of this, like Google being the creator of one of the frontier models. So I would say Google's a little bit of an outlier compared to most other companies. But let's take a step back here and let's imagine, I'm a UX researcher at a company that maybe has not been embracing this change or really has not been leaning into that change. We don't have access to enterprise level models. Maybe we're being told to just use our own personal accounts to Gemini or ChatGPT. What is a good starting point for that person? Like, that person doesn't have prompt libraries that are being created for them. What do you think a good starting point for that person would be?
The first thing I'm thinking about are, what are those tasks that you hate doing? What are the tasks that are taking you a long time? And that's the perfect incentive to experiment with generative AI. I'll be honest to say, one of the things that I don't like doing and spending too much time on are my emails and like wrangling my stakeholders to get their approval on a research plan or something like that. And even just drafting some of those communications, whether it's a chat message or an email, it's just something that honestly I don't like doing. I like to focus on my research. I like to communicate in person, all those things. And that was one of the first areas that I really started to being like, no, I don't like this. Like, I'm just going to use generative AI. Get me a baseline and then I'll adapt it to my voice. And because it's a task that I don't like doing, generative AI will speed up to 80% of the time for me to complete that task. And so, really, when you're getting started, think about those things. Reflect on your own processes, what you don't like doing at work. that could be improved or optimized through the use of an artificial intelligence, and start there.
Yeah. So what comes next then? So, I guess like another scenario would be like, I think what we're just kind of getting at here is a crawl, walk around approach, right? So like the crawl version is finding those low level tasks that take you time. You still need to do them. AI comes in and helps you improve the efficiency of that. Those are all super valuable use cases for I think the most valuable use cases for AI is using it as a thought partner, and you've kind of talked a lot about different examples for that. So how does someone go then from I'm using it to write emails, I'm using it to create blog posts, or I'm using it to write screener questions for me for research studies? How do you go from that to these really high value unlock use cases?
Yeah, it is such a habit to build. And truly, I'll be like, I'll find myself spinning on something in my head and then think, oh, wait, I should just let me ask Gemini. Like, what's Gemini going to tell me? And so I think it really is setting yourself up with that habit to say, let me just go and see what it's going to give me. It's not always going to be something that I'm going to end up using, but even just getting to that habit of how can this help me will really set you up for success in the long run. I think if we're thinking, that single point of interaction level with it where, yeah, we may be using it to help us with communications or with writing or ideation of something, the next kind of area then is reflecting at more of a project or product level. What are those opportunities where generative AI can come in and help me? And from there, you naturally do shift into this relationship with generative AI where it's just, those are the people that are using it multiple times a day. It's second nature to just go and ask. I've got Gemini, GPT, and Claude all on my phone, in addition to a bunch of other AI apps, because it is just part of my relationship with technology now. But you don't get to that overnight, and you don't get to that just by using them in isolation. You really start to feel that connection and the power when you follow it through, end to end from a project, from defining your research into the presentation of that research. Like going through the full cycle is when you'll really start to have those light bulb moments of, oh, I see what worked there. And this is where truly being such a reflective individual helps with that. Just like any sort of project retro, post-mortem type of thing, adapt that same thing to your usage of AI. Do, something like a quarterly check-in with yourself to say, am I doing more, or what worked, what didn't work? And you can do that from your organization level as well, just to say, we want to see this many queries that people are using. But it really is kind of that habit, that experimentation, and that reflective nature to say what's working, what isn't.
Yeah. So AI is proliferating like crazy, right? The models are constantly getting better. People are using them more and more for really interesting use cases, which you've talked a lot about. What excites you most about AI, whether it's in UX research or just in general? What are you most excited about?
In general, I'm just so pragmatically optimistic about it. Like I'm the type where it is really balancing the hopefulness with like the realism of it. So I use it in so many different contexts, from like personal things. I've been redecorating an apartment and saying like, okay, I want jewel tones. How can I match this rug with photo uploads and things like that? With some of my work on the side, crafting examples for my class on efficient UX, building out thought experiments for that has been just fantastic. In addition to just my 9 to 5 at Google and really embedding generative AI all throughout that, I would say I'm optimistic across the board. One of the things from an industry level, and I've always felt this way about generative AI since, the past couple of years when it's become quite present in our day-to-day communications. My grandmother knows about generative AI now. But I've always kind of felt like the chat experience would be short-lived. That was never something that I was incredibly passionate about, of saying, okay, chat's fine, whatever. But like for a standard consumer base, I just want a smart interface. I want more proactive recommendations and more contextually aware knowledge of, all those things that we talked about, like your business context, your personal context, your relationship with your stakeholders, almost that like second brain view. That's what I'm really excited about. Just, over time with generative AI from an industry perspective is we're truly only scratching the surface. And right now we're seeing so many of the same types of use cases. But as people get more experimental, I think we'll progress more into some creative problems to be solved through the use of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if chat is not the interface in the future, what would be the interface? Like what is it? How are we interacting and engaging with those tools?
I think chat can always play a role in the same way that search has kind of always played a role in experiences. But think about more personalized views of just where we have so much contextual understanding of what you need. How can we serve that up to you proactively? In the same way of, Amazon does this with their ads. There's a ton of AI built into the way that Amazon.com is set up. Do you always need to search for what you need? Sometimes it's right on that homepage because the data is so good and they know you so good. Whether it's something like, maybe it hears that you're redecorating your apartment, so now you all are gonna get a bunch of of ads for things like couches, or it's your actual behaviors, that contextual understanding can help our users accomplish their goals more quickly rather than just requiring a bidirectional chat interface.
This has been a fantastic conversation. So for show notes, including links to what we've talked about, visit usertesting.com/podcast. Alita, thank you so much for being on the show. This was a really, really awesome conversation. I know our listeners are going to love hearing this. So how does someone learn more about you? How do they learn more about your thought leadership? Even the work that you're doing at the Nielsen Norman Group. Where can they find out more?
Yeah, so great to be here. You guys can check out my NNG profile for all my publications and the classes that I teach. The efficient UX one, I think, is particularly so related to a lot of our conversations today about just reflecting on our workflows, identifying some areas of optimization for us, and experimenting with artificial intelligence. Besides that, of course, I'm available on LinkedIn where I post random things like the cheat sheet that I developed, which we'll also post a link to in the show notes.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Alita.
Thank you, Michael.